Hi, everyone. We'll give people the customary few minutes.
Hey, John.
It's a public holiday. Actually, it's not today. It's a public holiday tomorrow in Germany. But that leads to a long weekend for some folks. So I know we've got a couple of people not coming today. Hopefully we should have Ori and Steve. And I think I can speak for Henk on his PR. Morning, Steve.
Day, folks.
Congratulations on your new role, Steve. I'm sure that's going to work out very well.
Oh, thanks, Dick. It's exciting. It's a great group.
I agree.
Proverbial 3 to 5 minutes range.
Yeah, I think 5 is a maximum. It would be good if Charlie were able to make it. Otherwise, I think Neil and Dick, you can probably. Oh, Ray, yeah, we're here. We could always take the identity discussion back to the mailing list, but yeah, let's see. And otherwise, it will be good to get the scrappy stuff aired anyway. Yeah, okay. So let's. Hannes also can't make it today, so I'm going to open up the notepad to sign in. Okay. So we had the identity discussion from the mailing list, redefinition of feed, PR that I sent around last week. That's from Henk, and the scrappy Open API definition. Was there anything else, any other issues or PRs that anybody wanted to particularly raise? Oh, Ori's here. That's fantastic. That's good. Okay, so Ray, yep.
I just think at some point the feed question is still needs some more discussion.
Absolutely. So that's why that PR, the PR is a means of us having a sort of facilitated discussion rather than a fait accompli or anything like that. If that's how it seemed.
All right, good. I guess thanks.
Yeah. Yeah. It's also. I mean, it's quite old apart from anything else. But we need some way of actually making progress on that thing. Okay, so this could be quick. It could be not quick. The identity discussion. So I think there was good engagement around Isaac's proposal that we have sort of 4 options. Let me just copy those into the notes. So Isaac proposed for the meaning of the identity of corporate entities or whoever, we could either invent our own scheme. I think nobody liked that idea. We could adopt somebody else's scheme and require its use. We could adopt somebody else's scheme but make it optional. And I think nobody liked that option either because it doesn't really help either way. Or we could stay silent. And the only strong opinions that I saw pushed forward was the 4th one, which is to stay silent on the matter, allow multiple schemes and give plausible examples, but not actually enforce anything. I will confess to some bias of my own, that's also my preference in trying to create a syntax which can carry everything we need, but not have semantic understanding other than this is the same one as last time, of how we map a cryptographic or API identity to a real world identity. So I guess the easiest thing to say is somebody proposed that we just go with 4. Does anybody disagree with that? Yes, Ray?
I think that, well, my thought was that, gee, we have this transparency service and the thing to make statements into.
Yeah.
That it could be very useful for providing not just a syntax for, gee, this is a string and it's supposed to mean something, and we're going to hopefully figure it out. Instead, have a kind of a concept, kind of like a did document concept, where there's a document and it has maybe various types of identity in there, a name, location, et cetera, the Dun and Bradstreet number, anything you want. So the person would submit that into SCITT and they'd say, here's my claim of identity. And so SCITT could provide that sort of a facility, and then it would be kind of a combination of 1 and 4. We would say, here's how you make a claim to what identity is, here's how you submit it, and all the information about what you submit is kind of open season, and except for there are a number of already schemas that I think we could point to or maybe even recommend. So I'm kind of in that area where I think that we could do more than just nothing. Thanks.
Cool. I'm writing that down. Thank you, Dick.
Thank you, John. I agree with Ray. I think leaving it silent is going to result in some interoperability challenges for SCITT. I'll just point out a couple of things that I think we need to look at. Number one, the architecture itself has guidance with regard to authenticity and the need for trust anchors. So at some point, these trust anchors and authenticity really beg the need for a specific identifier that can be, verified. The second point I'll make is if we are indeed going to make the SCITT registry available to the public, then they may need the ability to, use or to have company identification information that can be vetted and verified. So those are the 2 things I would suggest that we consider before we reach a conclusion on this. Thanks.
So I kind of wrote up some of my thoughts in an email I responded to last week. The intersection between physical supply chain, which customs and border protections for various countries are trying to drive, with some identities that Ray's been dealing with, kind of bridges into firmware and software for the bill of materials. So identity becomes a lot harder. There's active discussions in that world and in that we kind of can't miss from a identity point of view. From the ledger's point of view, I don't think it really matters whether the RBAC functionality is the layer above that. And sorry, John, but I didn't see what 1 and 4 is. I'm looking through my mail. I didn't see the list.
Oh, sorry, I'm editing it on the Hedge doc as well.
Okay.
To keep it up there.
I'll go look.
So
look
number 1 was kind of at one extreme, invent our own scheme altogether.
Definitely not.
And number 4 is stay silent and accommodate multiple schemes, but just lead by example, not by, I guess to paraphrase, have informative examples, not normative architecture. And I think
I think it becomes an interesting thing if we start getting into ownership of products and who can make what types of evidence claims or make endorsements or anti-malware scans. That's where identity starts to really, really matter. From the ledger's point of view, I think we can slide for a little bit, and I would love to have Neil and Steve talk there.
Yeah, quite. So, well, I'll keep these notes. I'll respond to everybody at the end with something of a summary. But yeah, that makes sense to me. Thanks. Yeah, forgive me, everybody. Neil, you're next in the queue.
Try to multitask really.
With only one chair here, it's a bit tricky to keep up. So I just want to make sure I get through everything.
Thank you. I just want to, I'm perennially behind, so forgive me if I'm missing something. But the notion of company, I have a recollection that last week we briefly touched on this and said, oh yeah, we shouldn't use the term company because, as Steve just threw in response to me in the chat, it's an entity, a much more generic notion. I would like clarity here, but my sense is that even in general, a company is a very hard to control thing.
Yeah.
The kinds of entities that we want signing SBOMs and the like are going to be closer to a product team or something that is more authoritative and more flexible, because as we all know, products move from one company to another in acquisitions and split ups and stuff. So I just want to avoid the term company anywhere in our discussions, honestly, and be much more precise about who we want to and what kinds of things should sign we're talking about.
Yeah, good point. We have made that point a few times. So thank you, Steve.
There's two things. One is, yeah, I totally agree. I think we keep on using the word company as one of the types of identities. So we should probably just not use company when we're talking about it generically, because I think we fall into this trap as people try to sync up on, it may not be on every conversation, because there's an identity. It could be a company, it could be a project, it could be an individual. And in the registration policy of any SCITT instance, you can decide the types of identities, the specific identities you would allow. So that's, I think that's the point, is you get the best of all of them. For the company specifically, because this comes up a lot, or even project, who owns the project, who's maintaining the project. One of the huge value props of SCITT is that everything is timestamped. So while a company can change parent companies, and sometimes it goes better, sometimes it goes worse, right? The statement is always a point in time. It was a statement by this company at this point in time, which can be before it was acquired by Megacorp that killed the project, or it was after a certain time where that project became viable because a company pumped resources into it. So I think it's just interesting to think about the pieces where the two are tied together and that they're timestamped so that we actually know at what point we're referring to that entity. But the big one, just to tease into what Neil and Dick and others have been talking about, is the thing that I'm struggling a little bit is, while the feed ID is a string currently, and I think that you could put anything you want in it, including whatever identifier somebody decides. When we talk about identities, a SCITT sign statement is signed by an identity. So the piece that I've been just keep on thinking back is that identity what we've been talking about? The identity of the sign statement, can't that equal the company, the project, the person, the thing at a point in time? And I yield.
Yeah.
Thank you. Do you want to respond or just go to Dick?
Yeah, so I mean, this is at the heart of what I'm asking about, and what is the formal term currently used? I mean, are we talking about two different things? And maybe this is the same as what you just said. The existing architecture document, does it use the term issuer? Is that are there other identities? Are there other entities that the architecture is already talking about? And then I guess we're talking here in the context of how to deal with a feed, and is there something different that goes in the feed? So that's what I'm curious about.
Well, the issuer strictly only issues statements, and I think we concluded a long time ago that we want to enable feeds to contain statements from multiple parties, and so yeah, there's no. I don't think we can reasonably say that a feed is issued by an issuer. A feed will contain statements signed by potentially many issuers, but the issuer is the cryptographic or system identity that we use to tie to who made that statement.
Yes, dear.
I'll let John finish taking.
I'm in a phone call.
So the interesting question here, and I think this is where it's going to wrap around an axle, is if the notary or the ledger gets an issuer making a statement, it doesn't mean it's authoritative for the overall product. It may match the identity, like two competitors on the same feed. If you looked at the feed from the ledger, it may say, hey, A and B have both made claims, but who actually owns the product is over and above that. So it's great for live data, but the decision as to whether that data is applicable to the product is over and above what the ledger is. And I can see identity mattering for things like anti-malware companies, where you basically have a vetted set of companies that you're going to allow to make anti-malware claims. And then that gets into different roles and basically above this. The original reason I pushed for something that turned into feeds here was I needed to know when the policy for what the trusted roots or the trusted identification mechanisms supported by the issuer changed on the ledger, and we've morphed it into a little bit broader than that, and that's a little bit dangerous. And I think this is where the problem comes, Neil.
Okay, so first, if we can help by clear our hands in the queue, because it's kind of hard to follow at this point. I think Neil and Dick, your hands are just latent from before.
No, that's not true, Steve. I think Neil's was. I came in after the fact.
No, I agree, but okay, so do you want to respond to Roy?
Well, actually, I'd rather respond to what you and Neil had said earlier, and that is that, first off, I have no objection to replacing the whole concept of company ID with entity ID, if that's the direction that would be more, would be broader and still accomplish the task. So, with regard to what we refer to, I would make the proposal that we just go ahead and strike this concept of company ID and refer to entity ID when we're talking about this particular item that's on the table. Thanks.
Comments. I'm responding to Neil's question. So I understand that. The interesting problem we're trying to solve is the difference between a product and part of the infrastructure. And what we're designing here is the infrastructure. And let's please not mix the two of them. The way Active Directory for Microsoft distinguished a user, a human, from a drone or product or company was the fact that it was email enabled. So that having email on a product doesn't make a lot of sense, which is why I'm really pushing against email and FQDN as, hey, this is important. If you buy into the thing that a product has an identity, then email enabled or a distribution list for it makes a little bit weird behavior. And I think this is where verifiable identity and some of the things that is happening on the physical side kind of bring into this story where we have some designs that have to go through on multiple fronts. I'm a little nervous about, hey, killing the idea of what feeds give us because it gives us information flow, but trying to determine that it's authoritative for a product, I think it becomes a little bit problematic.
We're kind of back in the queue order just to try to catch up. So what do we, if we, in SCITT, feed is a string, and we're saying, one of the things we're saying is anybody can put whatever identifier you want in that. And so certain industries or certain verticals, whatever, could use as a generic spec. What I'm also questioning, though, is, and Roy, I think this is the root of what you touched on, is who owns the product as opposed to who's making statements about the product. And product equals artifact, just to be careful about terminology, right? The root artifact. I ship a Windows version 11.6.3, and then a bunch of people want to make a bunch of statements about it. One of the ideas I've been playing with is, could the feed identifier be a statement itself, which has an identity associated with it? So if Microsoft wants to claim the identity of the Windows 11 6.3.2 feed, then there's an identity to that statement. And then that feed ID is the registration ID. I forget what exactly we call it. So now there's no question who owns that, but then lots of entities, to practice the reference name, can make statements about it, and you can choose to trust those statements or not, but at least it's identified. The feed was created by the Microsoft identity tied to the signed SCITT statement.
It gets into a whole bunch of questions of how do you stop squatting and a bunch of other things. But yeah, and then it gets into what is the creation mechanism. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I still think we're going to end up with a set of global companies that are allowed to scribble on everybody else's product for sources of information, either MITRE with CVEs or Norton for antivirus. But yeah, you need to sketch that out for me, Steve, how you think that works.
And I think that's both problematic and good. And it's the registration policy can solve it, but we should document that and let I see the queue is closed, so somebody's trying to move on. So let's wrap up this one. I guess you're next, or Dick, sorry.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah, I'll be really brief. Just responding to Roy's point about, entities can really be anyone. I agree. They can. In fact, REA uses a lot of open source software in our products, and many times those components are identified with an email address. They're not, they're not a company. They're some individual. I suppose if I ask the team if everyone knows who EAY is when I talk about OpenSSL, my guess is people will be aware that that's Eric Young, and you used to communicate with him on OpenSSL matters directly with his email. So I think that we need to be conscious and support the fact that any entity, a company or person, can issue produce products, and people can make statements about those products with an actual identity in making a trust statement in the registry. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I have two comments. I was discussing on the feed, looking at the feed ID statements or comments made by Steve, and I think it's pretty much Steve is echoing what I made it during the last week. Is we can have a feed identity which is feed identifier which is made up of it's kind of a composite identity where the first bit is the organization or the vendor or say Microsoft, followed by some kind of a product identity which talks about the product, and the version which kind of talking about a specific version of that product. So that kind of thing we can always give an example, we can normate it, but feed is kind of a flexible thing. It just has to remain as a t-star or a string in our spec, because it's up to the individual implementations to kind of say how they want to name their products or identify them. So that's on the feed. On the identity, company identity, I think this is again a very difficult subject. I don't think we should kind of do a very strict prescriptive thing, but again we can give an example where companies do register themselves in a nation, like a company registered identity is issued for registered companies, and we can try to give examples using those registered identity, and they will be unique across the country, not outside the country, but you need to set the context when you're doing the verification, and then you might get some uniqueness out there. So that's my comment on that. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Yogesh. So just in the interest of fairness and agenda, I locked the queue because we've had the first half of the meeting on this. If anyone has a burning desire to add to this, please put your hand up now. Otherwise, I think, I mean, I heard quite a lot of consensus there for how to move forward. So from what's been said and from my experience of implementing things like this, on the company's side, I think everybody's agreed that we don't want to get into the tricky business of what a company is, and particularly not over the course of its life as it starts up, shuts down, gets merged, and all sorts of nonsense like that. But we do need to enable people to discover those kinds of things. So if I find something that was signed by a company in 2000, and then I find another thing signed by the same identity in 2010, it is possible for me to see that it had a different parent or structure or whatever. And I think that is important. But that's covered in what Roy said and what Steve said, that we don't have to have, in fact, we mustn't have the ledger identity being forced to be the same as a real world one. We just have to have that linkage possible to find. If that's true, then all we need to do to answer the question that was on the mailing list is we do need to invent our own scheme, in that we need a syntax for carrying that information. I think there's several of us made a compelling point for saying, you know, I'm identifying by some scheme, and here's the data for that scheme. But we don't need to force any particular one of them. We just need to be things we can point at and say, this will work if your transparency service supports it. So I mean, that all sounds quite straightforward to me, and a thing that doesn't need a lot of working on, other than, and this is a nice segue into the scrappy PR that I wanted us to look at today. Does the feed identity point at some structure? Steve made the suggestion that it could even be a statement, and so it would point at a cryptographically sealed structure, which is all part of the evidence base, or it could just point to a free bit of configuration that lives in the transparency service. It's an open question. Or does it need to be something that's self-describing? So like Yogesh was suggesting, that we actually sort of serialize some kind of structured thing into a one-liner, and the feed identity kind of describes it at rest exactly what it points to and for what purposes. So I think that last question seems like an open question that we should think about. But yeah, I'll tell you, any comments on that or things that people thought were misrepresented, please speak up now. Otherwise, it'd be great to look at Ori's PR for Scrappy, because I think it addresses those questions quite nicely.
John, I just put up a question in the chat. Have we reached a consensus on use of entity ID versus company ID, or is that still an open issue?
I'm much happier with entity ID than company ID, so from my point of view, it's fine.
Thank you.
Yeah,
You're going to have to be
We'll
flexible. I think you're going to have to be flexible there. You know, organizational identity for email is the guard at the gate, not the human that satisfies the need. So it'll probably change by country or by culture. And so I don't think we want to. We can give an example, but I wouldn't want to define it as must.
Yeah, that's sensible. We'll need to review, and everything will need to be reviewed in our docs in the end and make sure they're consistent. But I think it's going in the right direction. It has to be more flexible than less, and it still makes sense that way. Yeah. So Ray, just reckon, since we're in the chat, the second question also covered by Ray here. The entity ID should be a link to another signed statement in SCITT, which can provide a longer description. Yeah. So that was essentially the proposal from Steve, and it. That was on feed IDs, but it works the same way that SCITT can eat its own dog food, in a sense, in storing why it thinks, or the basis why it thinks a particular identity means something, and that's, I think, quite a good thing to do. Okay, cool. So thank you very much for that. I think that's good. We can follow up on the mailing list for those who weren't able to make it today, but I think that's good. So I've got the Scrappy PR up. Ori, are you happy to talk through this? Are you prepared for that?
Hopefully you all can hear me.
Yep.
If you can screen share and take us through, I'm happy to talk over it.
If I can find the screen share, where's it going? Here it is. Yep.
And there's some construction outside. Hopefully it's not too loud for you all.
Nope, it's good. So
Okay.
where do you want me to go?
Let's just stay here at the top for a second. So just recapping, we had an API definition in our architecture document, and in order to progress the API independent of the architecture, there's a proposal to separate them, and the API is now Scrappy. And the way to think about the API is it's an interoperability point. It defines interfaces that clients can implement support for, and that support for the API will abstract your need to interact with a particular ledger system. But in order for it to achieve success on that front, it needs to support the core operations that SCITT requires, which is it needs to support the registering of signed statements, the retrieving of receipts, and potentially other discovery or metadata related endpoints for the transparency service. So what I've done here is basically the first couple lines are about issuer or signing entity identity discovery. So lines 21 to 26 are about discovering issuers and discovering controller documents, which are keys, which hold keys for the transparency service when the transparency service is using decentralized identifiers. So lines 21 to 26 are entirely about discovering key material for the transparency service itself. And then that's important because when you verify a receipt from a transparency service, you need to know how to discover keys from that transparency service. So that's what those lines do. Line 28 to 29 is about discovering keys associated with an issuer. And it assumes that the issuer has an identifier that is URL safe here. You know, that could be a problem in the future if the identifier for the issuer was another URL, or you know, details matter there on how you're identifying issuers. But it's just to say that transparency services have a view of issuers because they make it signed by issuers transparent. So that if you talk to any transparency service, if it's seen any traffic, it will have seen some issuers, and it might be able to answer questions like, what keys are associated with this issuer, or what keys have I used to verify signed statements associated with this issuer. Then it has this statements endpoint, which is where you send your signed statement in order to make it transparent. And then a receipts endpoint, which is where you retrieve a receipt for a given statement that's been made transparent. And these kind of line up existing API definitions that we have in the emulator and that we had in the architecture. There's some sort of minor, I guess, like API aesthetic design improvements here, which, you know, maybe they're contentious, but the existing API definitions had the word entry, which wasn't associated with our domain language at all. So I've aligned these endpoints with the domain language that we have today, which is issuers, statements, receipts, transparent statements, etc. And then if you scroll down a little bit further, you'll see that there's now feeds. And so we understand that the transparency service has an ability to express collections of statements that it's made transparent, or collections of receipts associated with statements that it's witnessed. And the transparency service controls a resource representation of those receipts. And we use in two different ways in SCITT, which is part of why it's so difficult to understand. There's a view of feed, which is resources constructed and represented by the transparency service, and those might have URLs. So you can see here, you know, you might have a URL that says, show me the feeds that are available to me on this transparency service, or show me all of the elements of a specific feed available on this transparency service. And then there's the issuer of the signed statements view of the feed, where they include the feed and the registration info in their protected header. And that's at the cozy envelope layer before registration has been succeeded. So what you're going to see in this API definition is actually the sort of end, not the beginning. It's after the transparency service has accepted signed statements for registration. How will the transparency service potentially expose representations of what? And the proposal here is to use URLs to expose those resource representations. And there's two particular endpoint definitions here: a list view and a detailed view for feeds. And then there's some sort of scope details down here. This is to hint at, you know, hey, when you have resources, you have access control considerations. You know, maybe you have OAuth 2, maybe you have scopes, maybe you have RAR. There's a lot of different ways you can handle authorization, but you need to start thinking about it as soon as you start thinking about resources on a server. And then I think there's further down, eventually there'll be a example of possible feeds, which might be good to just leave up until everyone gets thoroughly frustrated at looking at it, because it's just examples. Yeah, keep going. Yeah, this is good, this one. So these are examples, and the idea here is this example response, which starts on line 9 and goes to line 25, could be the JSON response from requesting the feeds list for a transparency service. So here the transparency service would be vendor.transparency.example over HTTPS, and it would expose some feed resources for 3 different cases. And I just picked 3 cases that were different enough to kind of try and convey that feeds are supposed to be very flexible. So the first one is a CPE feed, which builds on the CPE identifier and information regarding that particular CPE identifier, which you can go read more about CPEs if you like. There's a link there. And then the second one is a Perl identifier, and that's going to give you information regarding that particular Perl. You can read more about what Perls are at the link provided. And the final one is a GS1 digital link based feed, which you can read more about what GS1 digital link is at the link provided. But GS1 digital link is essentially a way of converting barcodes into URLs. And so if you've ever picked up a package that had, an interesting barcode or QR code on it, and you wanted to know more about the product that you're holding in your hand, maybe you want to know what tests were run on the pharmaceutical bottle that you're holding, or you're interested in where the steel that went into the tool that you're thinking about buying came from. So GS1 is a way to discover information regarding GTINs and other GS1 product identifiers. And they have a structure that is very similar to feeds. In fact, like, you dereference a URL and you obtain a list of linked resources from it. I'm getting into the details around GS1 digital link because it's important for folks to understand that this problem of discovering related resources when you're holding a given identifier is not a new problem. It's been around for a very long time, and different organizations have solved it in different ways. And GS1 digital, in my opinion, one of the better solutions out there to be inspired by. So that's a summary, and happy to take any kind of questions around it, or I can dive into further details around how I see these resources connecting to the envelopes and protocol operations that SCITT provides.
Cool, very good. Thanks, Ori. So I'll take the Q questions, but just to say a big reason why I wanted to raise this above any of the other sort of PRs and issues and things is because in keeping with rough consensus and running code in IETF, if we think this is largely right, I think we can sort of add this to the emulator, get it running, and people can try it out rather than just talking around the issue. So hopefully that shows a good way, a good practical way forward. So Dick.
John, thank you, Ori. That was very helpful. So it seems like your examples confirmed basically what I interpreted, which is that identities have to be represented with a URL and not a URI. And I'll just point out that the example that you showed with the Perl, I think, is going to be an invalid URL in terms of just being able to use that Perl syntax is within the context of that sentence. And I think you'll end up having to make that something different in order to fit it into a URL, maybe make it a parameter or something. But anyways, just wanted to point out that URLs could be an issue if we constrain it to that. URIs may be a bit more broader in providing lots of opportunities if we're going with option 4, which is to allow anything. Thanks.
Cool, Steve.
I was typing so much I forgot my point. So,
no worries, I'll take over. Oh, were you not in the queue, Steve?
Yeah. Are you still in the queue, or you went out? So I was confused.
I went out because I forgot what I was typing and I lost track. So
okay, Yogesh.
Yeah. So, Ori, just one question. So the example feeds you have taken are kind of based on certain assumptions about design consideration, or this is just some kind of thought process which you think is the way forward on feed That's one question I have.
I'll respond to both questions. So the first point is like on whether you can construct URLs with your URNs or URIs inside of them, and you can do that. I think it's important to note that transparency service is a location sort of specific concept. Like transparency service resources will always have some location sort of awareness because there's a service operator and they will expose themselves on protocols that support location or that don't. And unless we're talking about specific protocols other than HTTPS, transparency service resources will have a location specific identifier that will be a URL. And then they'll have resources underneath that URL and paths. Some of those resources will have identifiers that are compound or that are composite, that are made of other URLs, like I think Dick was mentioning. And these are just, that's what I'm showing here. Like I took identifiers for CPE, for Perl, and for GS1 digital link, just added them to the transparency service. There's many different ways you could do that. But the point was to say the transparency service is a logical entity that hosts resources, and it needs to expose those resources based on identifiers that are not related to it, that have been submitted to it. So CPEs, Perls, GS1 digital links, those are the identifiers that are getting submitted to the transparency service. But when you ask a transparency service, what identifiers have you seen, you're going to get resource representations of the answer to that are going to refer to the identifiers that it's seen. So if you're looking for a specific GS1 digital link, you can ask a specific transparency service whether it's seen it or not. And if you expose that question as a query in a URL format, then you'll have a URL that contains two identifiers, the transparency service identifier and the resource identifier you're asking a question about. And so I just put the two identifiers that I understand to be important to the question in a single example. There's many different ways you could do that. That's it.
Grant,
Yogesh,
were you wanting to respond to that? Oh no. Okay, Ray.
Yes. So I just wanted to clarify. All right. So I'm looking at these items inside your example that you showed at the very end, and you have an ID, which is a URL to another, somebody else's construction, and then description, and you say, here's how you learn more about it. So that first part, which you say is ID, would that be the feed ID that would occur in signed statements submitted to SCITT? Is that the idea?
An excellent question. And I think the answer to that might be no, or it might be yes. It's not actually clear to me. So I mentioned at the beginning that feed shows up in two places. It shows up as resources exposed on the transparency service. That's what you see in this example. And their resources exposed on the transparency service, that is a transparency service, and their URLs. But the signed statements had to be submitted in order to basically make these feeds have any data underneath them. They could have this exact identifier repeated, in which case I'm an issue sign my statement exactly the identity and feed of the transparency service that will expose this. If I know that at the time in which I'm signing, then the protected header can include the exact identifier intending to make my signed statement about. But I might not know that. I might just be a box, in the back alleys of some internet, signing something. Transparency service is going to aggregate my signed statement into an expression of a feed, And so in that case, I might still have a feed identifier, but it won't have the location awareness about the feed, the ultimate feeds that would expose the receipt for the signed statement. So an example of that would be fire is just a random GUID v4 and actually several different transparency servers that particular receipt with different URLs. I don't understand really, if that's a case that SCITT is trying to support or not, because we tend to not talk about the specific envelope and the specific URLs that are kind of going to get formed by applying that envelope. But if you just focus on just that problem, you have two cases. Either the issuer always knows the single location, the single feed will include their signed statement. The transparency service gets to decide how many different feeds they can create from a single given signed statement.
Okay, I don't know if that clarified any. You raised so many things. So let me just clarify this one thing. So when you say here in your first, you gave these three examples. You have the first one is a NIST NVD CPE base feed. So is that feed that you're referring to, does that exist somewhere else and we're just kind of looking at it as an example? Or is it that we're trying to implement that feed within SCITT and replace or actually not necessarily replace, but create the feed within SCITT? What were you showing there?
Sure. So the CPE one's actually a great example because CPEs don't have any concept of location. So if you just looking at the string, if you see the feed /CPE and the CPE colon 2.3. So CPE colon 2.3, that's an example I just pulled, the PE identifier. Everything that comes before that is a path-based route on a transparency. And imagine many different transparency services might have information about the same CPE identifier.
Okay, so what was the answer to my question then? Would we be attempting to create that feed within SCITT, or is this an example of a different feed that is similar to SCITT? What are you showing there?
I mean, the question sort of doesn't make sense. CPEs exist already today. SCITT transparency services don't really exist today, but we understand them to be, each of them has a different identifier, which is represented with a URL. When we create identifier schemes in our SCITT API, we are creating new identifiers. Every unique URL is a identifier. And so if we create a structure for creating URLs that include the transparency service other identifier scheme, we're creating an entire namespace of identifiers. Transparency services gives you a new universe, but where the right-hand side identity, they will show up in both, first universe and second universe, and potentially all universes if it's a really popular CPE.
Okay, I guess I'm gonna have to study this some more to understand. The concept of feed before, a lot of times was related to a product name. Okay, like here's my general product name, not the version necessarily or instance of it, but just a general product. And I was thinking in my mind that there's kind of two realms here about tracking things. One is where the product is a digital thing and you can actually get a copy of it, and the other one is where it's a real thing, and you have instances of it that come through and are individually tracked perhaps, but have documentation that's basically the same except for just it's a new instance. That's a slightly different thing that we'll have to keep in mind. But so let's say we have a product. Would this it seems like what you're showing here are some examples of other feeds that exist today, and that we might want to model our feed ID around. Is that correct? I guess maybe I don't want to take the floor too long. We're getting to the end of the meeting, so let me just take this aside and I'll study it some more. Yeah. Thank you.
So I didn't get cut off from the queue yet. So I think what I'm hearing is what we're saying is exactly what you just said, right? Is that we've started with software when you make a compiled piece of, not compiled, when you have a piece of software that you want to release, everybody that makes a copy of that is an exact copy, right? There's no difference between all the copies, and that's what the hash and all the other things that make sure that there's no difference. Then there's physical goods. When you make copies of a particular version, and gas pumps was the one that always really resonated with me. And if I shipped the exact same copy of 2 created gas pumps to Colorado and Florida, they will vary over time because of temperature. So we need a way to track those individually. Or documents that might version over time. I think this is the reason where I've come around full circle too is making the feed be just a string, and there's an interesting dictionary that's associated with it also, which we don't have time to cover today, that allows different industries to use that standard for what makes sense to them. So it really gives a structure that allows you to accomplish the goal. The core thing that I think we're saying, and Antoine and Cedric were bringing this up continuously, is we want to make a collection of statements over time about a thing. The thing is identified by the feed ID. What somebody wants the thing to be is up to that industry. In software, we're saying it's a piece of software that gets released. So the feed ID equals that software. In physical goods, it might be an additional instanced ID. But the spec gives that flexibility. And I think the examples that Ori's been helping put together really help make this more concrete.
Great, thanks, Steve. So yeah, we are down to the last couple of minutes. I think those are important questions. But again, all of the questions to me point back within our work and within our charter. They all point back to the fact that we have to define a syntax and a set of building blocks that accommodate maybe not all of these options, but several different options to recognize the different kinds of usage it will go to, and then provide a way of people querying it. So yeah, so I'll remind in follow-up to this meeting, I'll send a message around the mailing list reminding or suggesting that people look at this PR. But I think it's a good way to test whether all of these these questions are answered, to go ahead and try it out in the emulator and see what it looks like. So unless anybody has any great concerns that it's actually wrong, as opposed to just being possibly incomplete or not quite perfect, taking account of things like URL versus URI or whatever, sounds to me like this is a good track to go down, and we should be looking at approving that PR. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
So,
Please share that, because we need to look at it. I was not aware that pull request is coming, and so we need to look at it carefully. And yeah,
absolutely, it was in the agenda reminder I sent round last week. It was only a few days ago. I'll send it around.
Also, a link to it in number 11. Ori put a link there with his recommendation.
Yeah, but I'll put it on the list anyway, because not everybody can make it today. So I'll put that out for review.
Sure, that would be really helpful, and then we'll review it. If you have any questions, I think we can quickly close this in the next Monday call, because all the comments, I would request everyone to put the comments in the pull request itself, whatever it may be, and then we can help it move faster.
Yeah, lovely. Okay, I'm writing that right now. So thanks very much, and catch you later.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Dick, if you're still on, thanks for helping me out. I finally got on. Talk to you later. Hey, dear. Dear. We have to go get the car by 5 minutes of 1.
You're still on audio.
Oh, sorry about that. Trying to leave the room here. Thank you.